the landscape of the British Isles. Some of the most varied and beautiful scenery of any area of comparable size on the surface of the Earth. The creation of a complex and sensitive mechanism fueled by the energy of the sun in a never-ending process of change. Breaking up the fabric of the land, transporting it, and reconstructing it in other places and in different forms. The quartzite of these rocks on the Stiper stones in Shropshire is strong enough, hard enough, resistant enough to have been left here sticking up out of the hills while everything else was worn down and swept away. Over hundreds of millions of years, this part of the Earth's crust has drifted gradually from well south of the equator. During that time, part of the molten magma beneath solidified into granite, then rotted down into sand and clay. They, in turn, were cemented into sandstone, which was melted again and subjected to immense pressure, changing its chemistry, turning it into quartzite. And now it's laid bare again, half the age of the Earth, to form the Stiper stones in Shropshire. Britain and Ireland are made up of a kaleidoscopic variety of different materials, each with its own history, like that quartzite. That's one of the reasons that we have such a variety of different landscapes. This is the oldest of them all, the gneiss of the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. The Langdale pikes in the English Lake District were formed from volcanic lavas. Igneous rocks like these have come from the furnace of the Earth's interior. Some of them, the metamorphic rocks, have been fired in that furnace, like pottery in a kiln. As a result, their structure is hard, tight, and compact. That's why most of our old, tough landscapes are made of igneous and metamorphic rocks. A few have a different kind of history, though. The Torridon sandstone in northwest Scotland is sedimentary. It's formed of sand grains and gravel washed out on an arid plain in a desert climate and chemically welded together.
Those older, tougher materials make up the fabric of the mountain landscape of the British Isles, mainly in the north and west of our two main islands. The mountains are there because those materials resist the weathering effects of sun and wind, ice, frost, rain, and rivers better than younger materials like those that I'm standing on.
Very flat, Norfolk, was how Noel Coward described where I'm standing. But even Norfolk has its hills. These two lumps near Norfolk's north coast are Muckleborough Hill and Telegraph Hill. This is the other end of the scale from the old baked mountain landscapes in the north and west. This landscape here consists of some of the youngest and weakest of all the materials that make up Britain and Ireland. Just east of here, the land around the Norfolk Broads and down into East Suffolk is made up of loosely knit gravels and shelly sands. They settled at the bottom of river estuaries and shallow seas within only the last 2 to 3 million years. If we imagine that the Earth is only 100 years old, that's not more than 3 weeks ago. On the same 100-year scale, the London clay in this pit was laid down on the floor of a shallow sea just over a year ago. All rocks eventually break down though, whatever their age or their origins. They're all attacked by the same natural weathering processes. Those processes work faster or slower according to several controlling factors. One of the controls, of course, is the nature of the particular rock they're attacking. The chalk of the South Downs, for example, is relatively weak. Here, it's been eroded away to expose the sands and clays of the Weald that it once covered. So the uplands of the British Isles are made largely of stronger rocks that have withstood the tests of time. The lowland landscape, like North Norfolk here, consists of younger, relatively weak materials. Andrew Gowdy, head of geography at Oxford University, is with me on a very windy Muckleborough Hill. It's sort of stating the obvious to say that Norfolk's flat, but presumably there's been a good deal of activity here geomorphologically.
Oh yes, it is flat in many ways. Not even the most rabid nationalist, Norfolk nationalist, would maintain that this was a very dramatic landscape. It's a very beautiful landscape, I love it, but it's subtle. But even though it's subtle, because we've got these rather weak materials here, a lot is going on. This is one of the most active coastlines in Britain, with the cliffs going back some yards each century. Then you had all those dramatic events in the early 1950s when you had all the flooding along the Norfolk coast. And inland, you've got wind whipping up the soils of the fields and the Breckland and causing sandstorms and dust storms and so on. It is actually quite an active landscape, even though it's so subtle.
So there are a lot of processes going on.
As everywhere on Earth, you've got the sun generating energy, and it's energy that molds the landscape. It's the sun that creates the rivers, the weather systems which generate the rain, which generates the rivers, that generate the snow, and all that sort of thing. Weather's absolutely essential to understanding geomorphology. It also generates life, the sun, because things like lichens, things like flowers, things like earthworms, they all get their energy ultimately from the sun, and they themselves do an awful lot of work in the landscape. There's an awful lot of them.
You said that energy molds the landscape. Is it the difference in the processes that gives us the difference between highland and lowland Britain?
It is in part, and obviously gravity is very important, but the key difference in the landscapes of different parts of Britain is really caused by the way in which different rock properties control the way in which the different processes operate. Take, for example, Darton, where we've got the granite. Now, the granite has a sort of texture. I know it's rock's not soft, but it's got the texture of brawn. It's got a lot of different coloured crystals in it, some of which are very easily attacked by rain, some of which are not. But they will not be attacked at all unless you've got joints in the rock. And in granite, you've got joints. And in some granites, you get relatively few cracks, and others you get a lot of cracks. But where you've got a lot of cracks, you'll get a lot of water coming in and breaking the rock down.
How did it do that?
The feldspars, particularly, which is one of these minerals in the brawn-like rock,
yes,
are particularly susceptible to being attacked. They're changed chemically, and this produces sand and clay and leaves a few big boulders remaining. Limestone, you don't even need the jointing in it because it is soluble in ordinary rainwater, which is an acid. It dissolves it away. It's going on all the time, quite slowly, but that's what produces the caves, the caverns, the arches that you see at places like Dovedale in Derbyshire. It gives you what I call a Gruyere landscape, full of holes, but very appealing.
So the ability of the fabric to withstand attack doesn't just depend on its hardness, it also depends on its chemistry and whether it's fissured and jointed.
Oh, and other things as well. For example, the amount of water that a material can absorb is absolutely crucial, because water is a very major cause of rock breakdown. Now, take, for example, frost weathering. That occurs when the water in the pores in a rock expands on freezing. The ice has a bigger volume than the water. Now, if you've got a lot of water, you'll get a lot of ice, you'll get a lot of frost shattering. Now, not all materials are very susceptible to that. Some are. Take, for example, the Lake District. You've got the volcanic rocks there, which have a lot of little holes in, so there can be a lot of water. So they are very susceptible to frost attack. And that's why at Wastwater you get these dramatic screes, because they're the product of a whole series of shattered blocks breaking off the cliff at the top of the valley, and it all tumbles down the scree into the lake. But it's not just necessarily frost that's important. Some other materials, like peat, for example, can absorb huge amounts of water, and the amount builds up, and sometimes you get quite dramatic peat bog bursts when the material goes off down the slope. Quite dramatic. Another crucial thing that we have is the relative resistance of one rock compared to another. Now, lots of examples in the British landscape. There's a very fine one in Scotland where you've got an old platform of gneiss, and into that there's a series of dolerite dikes that have been intruded, and they're two very different rocks. And the glaciers came over that, and they eroded the softer rock to give you the lochs, and it left the harder rock as upstanding little hills, and so you get the famous Knock and Lochen topography of northwest Scotland. It's the same with the horizontal bedding of rocks. It can bring you two very different types of rock in close proximity. And again, this is crucial with respect to water, because if we look at a lot of the British landscape, we see that where you've got a sandstone, for example, overlying a clay, you get an awful lot of landslipping. Now, the reason for this is that sandstone will absorb an awful lot of water, whereas clay tends not to. The clay, therefore, acts as a barrier to water movement. So you get a pressure of water building up in the sandstone, which causes it to fail. And that's the situation you've got on the Dorset coast and the Devon coast near Lyme Regis, at places like Black Ven.
This seems to be a picture which illustrates the British Isles, is that right?
Oh, I've just been talking at a rather local scale, but when you think of the whole of eastern England,
yes,
it's a landscape of ribs and gutters, and the ribs are made by the sandstones and by the limestones, and the gutters along which the rivers run are made by the clay. And the reason is that clay throws off water, so the rivers are very effective, can erode it away and give you the low-lying vales and so forth of the English landscape.
As Andrew Gowdy said, the different characters of the different rocks that form the landscape are a major factor in controlling the speed of natural weathering processes. The chemistry of the materials, whether they're cracked and jointed, how much water they can absorb, whether the rain can dissolve them. All these factors help to dictate the shape of a landscape. Movements in the Earth's crust play a part too. When two plates collided and pushed up the Alps and the Pyrenees, the shock waves lifted the chalk up from the floor of the sea. It was stretched into a great dome over southern England, and the bending and stretching weakened it. Frost, rain and rivers have since exploited the weakness and removed the middle of the chalk dome, exposing the older materials of the Weald. The North and South Downs are all that's left of the dome's rim. Movements in the Earth's crust, the sun, the wind, ice, frost and snow, rain, rivers, the force of gravity, even plants and animals, including man, they're all constantly working on the weaknesses of the different materials. It's an unceasing effort to turn the Earth into a uniformly smooth, featureless globe.
And they're fairly successful. There's more variation between the lumps and the crevices on the skin of this orange than there is, proportionally, between the tops of the highest mountains and the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches on the Earth's surface.
And there's the sea, too. It wears away at the land, and it fights back against the other forces, throwing materials up to form new land. More than 70% of the Earth's surface is seawater. The winds whip the oceans up into waves, and the waves throw immense amounts of energy onto the land. Along the Norfolk coast from Muckleburgh Hill, the sea is constructing Scolt Head Island. It's grown over the last 6,000 years as a series of shingle spits combed up by the waves of the North Sea. Wind-blown sand has formed dunes on the foundation of the shingle. Vegetation has stabilized the shingle and the dunes and then built the island up by trapping mud. The sea has created a whole new piece of land. It's all part of a hugely powerful landscape machine, constantly trying to wear down the mountains and fill up the oceans, to iron out all the Earth's wrinkles.
Given enough time, the efforts to level the land would succeed completely. They'd wear down even the hardest of the rocks, if it weren't for other factors controlling the forces and setting limits on what they can do. One fundamental inhibiting factor is climate.
Valleys like Llyn-Clydor in North Wales can only be carved out if it's cold enough for glaciers to form. It has to be hot and dry for sand and gravel to accumulate in a desert and eventually get cemented together, leaving us sandstone mountains in northwest Scotland 800 million years later. Climate, in turn, dictates sea level. When the climate's colder, more of the Earth's water is locked up in polar ice. The climate warms up, the ice melts, and the sea rises. That happened most recently between 14 and 6,000 years ago, and the sea rose 300 feet. It flooded back into the English Channel and scoured up shingle from as far away as Devon. It dumped up to 100 million tons of it here on the Dorset coast to build the 18-mile-long Chesil Beach.
Vegetation's an important control on the weathering processes too. Braunton Burrows in North Devon was a constantly shifting wilderness of sand dunes. Then the marram grass, followed by other plants, succeeded in getting them under control. What we do exerts a control too. And we do an awful lot to try to protect the fabric of the land from attack, or just from change. These colossal sea defences are near Folkestone in Kent. And of course, our interventions aren't confined to dry land. The human race and vegetation are two controls on the forces of nature as they change the land. But there isn't a lot they can do when the more powerful controls take over. Here in Norfolk, it was the climate. The temperature dropped 5 or 6 degrees centigrade. Sea level fell 300 feet, and there was a sheet of ice stretching all the way here from Norway. The young, weak landscape materials couldn't put up any real resistance to an attack on that scale. So how was it that Telegraph Hill in the foreground and Muckleborough Hill nearer the sea were left here at all?
In fact, they haven't been here all that long, only about 17 to 18,000 years. This was the furthest point south that the last ice sheet reached, and these hills record where it began to break up and retreat.
As the temperature rose, crevasses and hollows formed in the ice. They filled with meltwater and sand, gravel and clay. As it got warmer, the water started to flow, carrying the sands and clay with it. The lighter, smaller particles were washed out over the plain. The heavier stuff was dumped and moulded by the flowing water, leaving elongated shapes like Telegraph Hill. In some places, the water flow wasn't strong enough, or the materials were simply too large and heavy for the water to carry. The melting ice just left them in a lump, and that's what happened here to form Muckleborough Hill. In simple terms, that's why Norfolk isn't quite as flat as Noel Coward said it was.